Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for having me with you here today to talk to you about this really important subject. An observation to start. It's the first time in a long time I've not been the minority in the room I'm speaking to. And I really noticed the difference in energy and the difference in engagement levels when you were all coming into the room, some of the conversations we were having. It really is a wonderful thing to behold. We need more of it. So this gives me the perfect opportunity to talk to you about two things that I'm really passionate about. Women in business being the first, our progress, the opportunities, and anything we can all do to help others around us. But also cultures, different cultures. I'm convinced that some of this solution lies in learning from each other, learning from what works around the world. So I hope to learn a lot from all of you today, as much as perhaps there might be one or two things I can offer you from the UK. A little bit about me. This is a little bit about my life, because I think quite often women are stereotyped into one thing or another in a business environment. And so I am here as a business leader, but I'm also here as a mother of a variety of children from 21 down to 14 months. He indeed FaceTimed me, as some of my colleagues will tell you, just as I was about to rehearse. I am a wife to a fantastic husband who has an equally busy executive role like me and travels a lot. I train and compete my horses. I'm a runner, and I tend to be on some non-executive boards of some interesting charities and a couple of businesses. But you know, the thing about this is none of this came with an instruction manual or a superwoman cape. It was missing in the packaging. And so what I've had to do, like so many of you in this room, I'm sure, is to figure out the recipe, to work out, to continually balance and ask myself, how do I juggle all of these things and still be as brilliant as I want to be in my day job? And there are days when I get that right, and there are days when I get it wrong. And I suspect there's many of you in the room that can recognize that continual juggle, men and women. But we're all here today, as we just heard, to consider the question of gender balance on boards. And you'll hear a little bit later about the nomination committee processes. But I wonder if the business case is really made. I wonder if people really do understand and believe why this is so important. Will it, in fact, matter if we let things continue the way they are today? Will it make any difference to our daughters and their daughters if we continue to have them struggle to find role models to look up to? And will it matter to our customers and our societies if they continue to be run by teams of people who don't look like them? How much of the solution is about art and how much of it is about science? Let's remind us just a couple more facts from the ones you've heard as to why we think this is so important. Well, in a report this year by McKinsey, they estimated that if every country in the world matched the progress towards gender equality of their next nearest neighbour, that would be an increase of $12 trillion of GDP by 2025. The World Bank, in a joint study with Oliver Wyman earlier this year, estimated that firms who have more than 30%, which we see as a tipping point, of women on their board, are 5 times less likely to face bankruptcy and 4 times more likely to take significantly better risk decisions. In last year's survey of global graduates, and this survey had several 100,000 global graduates in it, they said they were 71% of them were strongly discouraged from joining a firm that had an all-male leadership team. And 40% of them said that they were unwilling to join a firm that had an all-male leadership team. They are the future leaders. Last week, as the 30% Club in the UK, some of you may have seen, we launched a strategic report called The Missing Millions. And this was us working with some of the world's biggest organisations, HSBC, WPP, Vodafone, PwC, and Unilever. And it was our attempt at turning the conversation to answer the question, does this matter beyond our employees and colleagues? What happens if you consider this for the buyers, for those making the decisions on your products and services? We looked at how you can diversify your supply chain. We looked at how to improve mobile phone access. There are an estimated 200 million women who currently don't have access to mobile phones where their male counterparts do. And we looked at how we can reduce those harmful stereotypes that you see in advertising too often. I could go on. You can read the report, you've seen the statistics, and you've read the studies. It really struck me reading the Sabanci report in the last few days that 38% of boards here are still all male. And that although the code here is comply and explain, I think only one firm has publicly talked about their target, their date, and their progress. We'll come back onto that governance a bit later on. That said, I also recognise the difference here. And I was chatting earlier on with some colleagues about the differences we see in the markets that we do the work in. And I realised that when you've got those highly concentrated ownership situations, so many controlling holding companies and family structures in place, it is different. And in some ways it is harder. Because even in countries where we know board structures work, we still know that progress towards women on them is low. So why is this so hard? Why is this seemingly such an unsolvable problem in so many places? If you've not come across it, I really recommend for you a book. It's by Caroline Criado Perez, and we'll put the link up later. She's written a book called Invisible Women, Exploring Data Bias. This is a strongly data-based book talking about the significant gaps between men and women in all kinds and parts of our lives. She uses data to explain the hundreds of ways that the bias is set against us from a very early age. Just take a look at these numbers. 3-to-1, 24%, and 75%. What could they possibly mean? Well, lots of things. But in this case, 3-to-1, it starts early. A 30-year study of 97 countries showed that men outnumber women 3-to-1 in school textbooks. It starts early. 24%, it's all around us. Women make up only 24% of those mentioned in TV, newspapers, and radio, and that has not progressed globally since 2010. I'm curious, I wonder, what would that data point look like here in Turkey alone? 75%. That's the amount of the unpaid work in the world that women do. That's all kinds of unpaid work. In some countries, it's harvesting crops, it might be collecting water, and it might be taking the children to school. In fact, in London, women are 3 times more likely to be the person that takes children and picks them up from school at both ends of the day. Consider the impact that has on working hours. All that data tells us is that women are just working harder to keep up, to get to baseline. It's a really interesting read, and if you're interested in research and data-led explanations, I highly recommend it. So we have the insight for change. We understand the bias. The question is, will we take advantage of it? The question is, will everyone in this room commit to something that creates some change for the women around them? In the UK, there has been good progress. That much is true, although it's a tale of two halves. Progress on boards, which has been mentioned, and I'll come on to, versus progress on executive teams and leadership teams in our biggest firms. And that's a different story. Now, these numbers might not be very easy to read in the audience, I understand that, so we will put them on the website, I think, afterwards. And it is actually, these numbers are actually on our own website as well. But what you can see is significant progress. This is our biggest 100 firms, and it's moved from 12.5% in 2011 to 32.4% this year. That's very significant progress, and we'll talk a little bit about how. You can see the numbers on the screens there for the 250 and the 350, and again, we'll share them. It's very blurry at this distance, but you may be able to see them slightly better. It is good news, and it is definitely progress. Interesting to compare it across markets, and the two that I've pulled out there are countries that have either made virtually no progress or gone backwards in the reference period. So this is not just a problem here in Turkey, and it's not just a problem in the UK. It's something we see everywhere. You can have all of this data later on. That progress has been a really focused, sustained result of many, many people. And again, this is a diagram I particularly like. It came in the Hampton-Alexander report, which we released last week. And this talks about the ecosystem. This talks about the multifaceted solution to moving that number. Because it really is a collaborative effort. It's a collaborative effort, if you look on the left-hand side, between the voices of women and some of the initiatives that are in place there. Government action, such as the Women in Finance Charter. I was involved in putting that together, where we called for all financial services businesses to commit, to publicly sign up to 7 commitments within it that would enable progress for women, and it was hard. Legislation such as gender pay gap reporting, which has forced transparency over pay. In the UK for 2019, the pay gap is 8.9%. That may not sound terrible, but I'll tell you, in financial services, in some firms, it's as high as 30%. Voices of men who are working side by side, and I have to say, I'm delighted to see so many men here today. I personally believe, excuse me, that a big part of the solution to this is having men with us, side by side, championing those men who are willing to drive it with us. For every man I meet who wants to do something about it, I equally meet a woman who doesn't. This is not about creating division. This is about collaboration, men and women working together. There are some business initiatives and regulatory requirements. We do have strong governance. We do have strong regulation. We do have a comply and explain code, and the majority of firms do comply. Very few have to explain. You will find people who tell you there are holes in it and it could be stronger. That is all true, but it has created the change we needed. The final part is really investors and shareholders, and we believe they play a really critical point. One of the strongest focuses for us as 30% Club in the last few years has been creating the Shareholder and Investor Club. We now have 32 global investment institutions who are part of it. They have £11 million of assets under management, £11 trillion rather, of assets under management. And they engage continually with organisations. They attend AGMs. They engage with boards. They ask them continually about diversity as a sustainability issue. Now, it's important to note we don't have a quota. Quotas are highly emotive debates, and we can get into that later. But because we don't have a quota, we've had to create this ecosystem of these bodies, these regulators, and these institutions working together in order to drive this change. Now, I said earlier on that progress was a tale of two halves in the UK, progress on the board versus progress on the executive and leadership teams. This is really key. One of the most common reasons we hear for women not being on boards is the phrase, well, there simply aren't enough women who are ready. There simply aren't enough women in the pipeline. Now, I have to tell you, I find that quite curious, because I suspect if we did a show of hands now, a lot of you would know of a woman who is board ready and struggles to find the opportunity. So it's quite a curious phrase, but let's go with it for a moment. It's why we believe at 30% that we have to focus on the pipeline, on the executive leadership pipeline, creating the future women board directors. In 2017, we went to all CEOs and chairs who had publicly committed to improving board diversity. And we said, since you've publicly committed to increasing your board directors, we'd like you to do the same for your leadership teams. And we got strong public commitment. CEOs are competitive creatures by nature. They like to be doing as well as at least their next best competitor. In 2019, 27.9% of firms have achieved that 30%, nearly a third. Not bad in 2 years, an awful long way to go. More worryingly, nearly 70% of all new roles are going to men. Now that means in order to hit the target, half of all future roles at the executive table will need to go to women. That is a huge ask, so we have a lot more to do here. Progress is just too slow. We could talk all day about the rest of the reasons for it, but we've got 3 things that I'll offer you as to how we think those who have made progress have done it. Demand diverse slates when you're hiring. Those of you who are CEOs and sit on boards, when you are hiring, demand, and I use the word demand deliberately. It's very easy to say, we have diverse slates. Of course we have diverse slates. But what I really mean by that is demand a 50-50 shortlist, and it's hard. It's really hard. But unless you start doing it, nothing changes. I talked last week to an executive chair of a US mining company, and I asked her about this, and she said, Sarah, it's interesting. She said, when I did this in the US mining sector, people said, give it 2 years, she'll get bored of it, it's too difficult. And I stuck with it, and it was really hard, and we had to kiss a lot of frogs. But I met a lot of people who I would never have met, who were interesting in other roles of our company, and now we've done it in one of the hardest sectors. So her advice was, be brave and stick with it. Last week Hampton-Alexander published a list of global search firms who are committed to doing this. And actually I'm delighted to see Egon Zehnder up there, because they are one of the 7 firms, only 7, who are really committed to doing this. So I hope somebody's here from Egon today, because that's a great recommendation. Second, critically review your culture. Lots of ways of describing culture. How we do things around here, what people do when no one tells you what to do. There's all sorts of ways, you know that. But really give it a hard review. One of my most favourite questions I often ask CEOs when we go and talk to them is, does your company, does your office feel like a place you would bring your mother, your sister, your daughter to work? And if it's family-owned, that's not a get-out clause, then ask, would you bring your best friend's daughter, mother, or sister to work? How does it feel when you're at work? It's a really important test, and I honestly believe this is half of the answer if we can solve the cultural challenges we see around us. I was chatting earlier with somebody you'll hear from the panel who said, how often is it, because I'm in financial services too, how often is it that we're in a room and we go to speak, or we go to see customers, or we go to meet colleagues, and we are the only woman? Too often. That's part of the culture. Lastly, and this deserves a day on its own, but please, please select people based on evidence and data, not relationships, not connections, not who has dinner with who. I see it all the time. I've heard some of the most outrageous and hilarious experiences of this. But it's really important we start selecting people on merit, on data, on evidence. Being that systematic really reduces the risk of bias. And just one slight note on mindset. When you set up that selection, when you're asking people to interview, are they bought into this objective? Do they really believe in what you're trying to do? Because any brilliant process is easily undone by a determined, biased person. Now, I have no way of predicting if you do all of that, it means you'll hire a man or a woman. But what I do know from experience is you will hire the best person, which is ultimately the most important part of all of this. And if you start with a balanced candidate list, you've got a far better chance of ending up with a balanced outcome. And in turn, you'll end up with a better leadership team and more board directors available for all those women that are apparently not available to be board directors right now. So I hope that's given you some things to think about. I hope possibly for some of you it's given you some things to consider for your own progression and your own career. I'm really looking forward to hearing from my colleagues on the panel later on, and from talking to some of you afterwards. I'll be around for a while. I think we might do some questions if people have got questions at the end. Change is really hard, we know that. But with all of you in this room, if everybody went away and did one small thing, I talk about this as 1,000,000 tiny steps to change. I really believe we could be standing here in 12 months' time with more significant progress. So once again, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to hearing the rest of my colleagues.